want this removed tonight. COVID-19 is a power grab hoax. COVID-19 is a scam. Is that your IQ? One finger? APD just did its job.
Pandemics. They're bad for humanity, but good for TV ratings. Until all the old people who are still watching TV die. Throughout all of human history, our greatest predators were not tigers, sharks, and crocodiles, but rather microscopic organisms, which we were unaware of the existence up until the 1500s. And this idea was not widely accepted as an explanation up until the 1800s. Before the advent of civilization, diseases did obviously exist, but it was far more difficult for an illness to spread, given that most people lived in a hunter-gatherer setting, moving from place to place following herds. Sure, they spread illnesses within their small groups, and even got diseases from the animals they interacted with, but this scenario lacked the population density and large-scale interconnection that would lead to massive pandemics. Before cities, the bulk of deaths due to pathogens were mosquito-borne, namely from malaria. However, malaria is not conventionally contagious. Sure, it can spread through organ transplants and blood transfusions, but I doubt those existed during the Stone Age. After all, mosquitoes are far more evil than the devil or even the god from the Old Testament. Mosquitoes kill nearly 1 million people a year to this day. They're kind of like insectoid Hitlers. But eventually the agricultural revolution would lead to larger and larger settlements and thereby more and more diseases to spread. Early cities were covered in piss, shit, livestock, rats, cockroaches, and dead corpses next to where people ate. Grandma may have passed away a few months ago, but she still joins us at the dinner table. In the past, contagious outbreaks were assumed to be the products of evil spirits, or perhaps the wrath of the gods. The gods were mad that humans were not worshipping them enough, so they got tens of thousands of people to die from sores and diarrhea.
Diarrhea is funny today, but 100 years ago, if your ass had diarrhea, you were a goner. There was like a 0 chance of survival. You get that first squirt, uh-oh. Better start getting my affairs in order.
Going back to the aforementioned evil spirits, before people knew about microscopic murderers, some thought that diseases were caused by the devil. Satan can be transmitted through coughs, sneezes, and even sexual intercourse. Eventually, natural explanations would come into the fold, such as the now discredited miasma theory, which stated that cholera in London was caused by toxic air. In reality, cholera was spread by people drinking water with shit particles. Cholera killed lots of people in the 1800s. Sanitation in cities back then wasn't very good. Just ask your doctor if shitting into a pond and then drinking from it is right for you. Remember the coronavirus pandemic? What I remember the most is the panic buying at the beginning of it. When shit hits the fan, people buy tons of toilet paper. Civilization might collapse, but at least people can take comfort in wiping their asses. I don't know why people panic buy toilet paper in times of crisis. I can understand stockpiling on food and water, but why toilet paper? Is the anxiety of their potential demise giving them the shits? Damn, we're only a few minutes into the video and I've already made way too many toilet jokes. More shit jokes to come. Speaking of toiletries, one of the reasons why diseases are so common is that throughout most of human recorded history, people lived in cramped conditions, sleeping, cooking, and next to open sewage. Very romantic. Some other guests at the house during that time were farm animals. And farm animals are not renowned for their personal hygiene. As anyone who has been to a petting zoo can attest, animals smell like shit. And unlike quasi-functional humans, they don't wipe their asses. Close contact to animals led to what is called zoonotic diseases, such as smallpox, which comes from cattle. Smallpox killed off most of the Native Americans during the 1400s to 1800s, even more than binge drinking and white devils. Don't worry, the Native Americans got their revenge by giving everyone else syphilis. Horny sailors could not keep their pants up. Aside from smallpox, quite possibly the greatest pandemic in human history, the most infamous of all time, is the Black Death, which happened a few centuries prior to the discovery of the Americas by Europeans, if you could call it a discovery. Now, everyone has heard of the Black Death, but many are unaware of a prelude to the Black Death called the Plague of Justinian during the 6th century, nearly 600 years beforehand. This was caused by the same bacterium, albeit with a far lower death toll. Like a large number of infamous pandemics, the Plague of Justinian, which ravaged the Eastern Mediterranean, probably came from China. This is a recurring trend, as Eastern China has the scale and population density to be the starting point of numerous global ailments. Now, the cause isn't that different in the modern day. In the early 20th century, we saw the Spanish flu, which, by the way, was not Spanish and might have emerged from China, although we really don't know for sure. And in the late 1950s, we saw one of the deadliest pandemics of influenza, ranging from 1 to 4 million deaths. Despite the relative recency and death toll of the 1957 to 1958 flu pandemic, it has largely been forgotten. It didn't even get that much attention during the 2020 pandemic. Nonetheless, it shows us that while most flu upticks every winter are manageable, some can be extremely dangerous. Speaking of recent history, let's go back to an event which cannot be forgotten, at least not anytime soon: COVID-19. The virus may have come from a bat, which may have passed it on to a pangolin, which is like a weird anteater armadillo thing, if you could call it that. Millions of people died and the world economy went into the hellhole because some person in China wanted to eat a pangolin scrotum marinated in bat soup. Some rich people in China drink the broth of a boiled pangolin fetus because it supposedly increases virility. I still can't get over the fact that there is a possibility, and I say a possibility, not a certainty, that many of us all around the world, billions of people, spent over a year in quarantine because some rich Chinese guys needed an armadillo abortion stew to get their dicks hard. Either get some Viagra or find a mistress who isn't fat and ugly. Granted, we were relatively lucky during this pandemic. After all, we've all heard of the aforementioned Black Death. For all the terrible diseases that have existed today, at least none of the major ones give you swollen lymph nodes the size of strawberries. The bubonic plague was arguably the largest dip in population throughout all of recorded history. It was spread off the back of fleas, which were on the backs of rats, on the backs of oftentimes Mongols or any merchant or soldier crossing the Silk Road. This was the worst combination of being extremely contagious and deadly at the same time. A pandemic which spread across most of the old world, only rivaled by smallpox death tolls in the New World. Some thought diseases were the result of God getting pissed off, as I mentioned before. Maybe he was mad that not enough people prayed, or there were too many gay orgies, so the loving God gave everybody mumps and diarrhea. That's an effective method of preventing anal sex. Speaking of bodily fluids, Ebola is really hard to get because it's contracted from blood, vomit, and feces, as well as other bodily organisms that I can't mention because of the YouTube algorithm. Ebola is a zoonotic disease, as many are, and it comes from bats. Bats are notorious for being reservoir hosts for a number of diseases, spreading it to other mammals, which oftentimes infects humans, or spreading it to humans directly. To this day, we still really don't know why bats carry so many diseases. Some claim that it's because they fly and that raises their body temperature, making them immune to the viruses they hold. There are other arguments that the torsion that occurs from their flight makes them more resistant to viruses that we don't have immunity to. We still don't have an answer to this question. Nonetheless, as far as Ebola is concerned, you really don't have to worry about it unless you live in West Africa or have a furry and scat fetish. Ebola is extremely dangerous, don't get me wrong, but it's hard to spread. This is the reason why it became a series of epidemics rather than pandemics in the early 2010s in West Africa, but it lacks the ability to spread rapidly, so it never became a global pandemic. On the other hand, influenza is extremely contagious, but its fatality rate is rather low for people who are not very old or suffering through pre-existing conditions. Influenza is ubiquitous and highly adaptive, but mutations aren't dangerous enough to bring the world to heel. Well, unless you're the Spanish flu. The pan in pandemic means all, as in all over the globe. The SARS outbreak of the early to mid-2000s hit East Asia hard. It eventually became transcontinental with the first cases found in Canada. However, it eventually died down. Well, until 2019 when a coronavirus of the same genus was discovered in Wuhan. The Great Coup of 2020 was extremely contagious, but not particularly deadly compared to past historical pandemics. Now keep in mind, whenever a crisis hits, it's not just the biological element that matters. There's also a social and psychological set of elements. The scammers come out to play. During the COVID-19 pandemic, a televangelist claimed that he could blow away the virus through what he called the wind of God for 3 easy payments of $50. God accepts payments through credit, debit, cash, Bitcoin, and goat sacrifices. A future pandemic would almost certainly lead not only to a large sum of people perishing, but also increased societal dysfunction due to lower trust in authority, lower societal trust in general, alongside increased emotional suffering, along with the physical suffering due to the illness itself. What happened during the first few years of this decade will not be the last pandemic. As horrific as it was, it could have been far worse, as the digitalization of the economy allowed many people to work from home, thus reducing the spread of the disease. However, the highly interconnected globalized world we live in made the spread of the disease faster than it ever would be on horseback or wooden ship. While outbreaks like Ebola hit Africa hard, the coup spared rural Africa more than any other region due to that part of the world's disconnection from globalization due to its relative lack of wealth. Isolation can protect some people from impending doom, until that isolation withers away. The perfect example of this is the aforementioned New World. The New World didn't have smallpox and a host of other diseases, since cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, chickens, and other animals native to the Old World could not spread zoonotic diseases to humans. Once Europeans arrived, bacterium and viruses killed more people than any amount of steel and gunpowder could. The same pattern happened to other populations in Australia and Pacific Island nations. Far later on, during the Cold War, the US and USSR put their differences aside and teamed up against smallpox, virtually eliminating the pathogen by 1980. Today, it only survives for research purposes in Atlanta, Georgia, the hometown of the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, as well as Klotsovo in Russia. Even as these two powers had the power to end civilization using nukes, they both teamed up in unison to destroy humanity's greatest enemy, a quasi-organism that can't be seen with the naked eye. To this day, the strongest argument for not contacting isolated tribes is that contact could easily spread pathogens which, while harmless to us, could kill off their entire populations which are not acquainted to those deadly pathogens. Back in 1969, when Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins returned from the moon, they had to greet President Nixon in quarantine, as they had to isolate for a week due to a fear of moon bugs, or moon pathogens. To be clear, even if there is life on the moon, the microbes would almost certainly not be able to spread and infect humans. Pathogens are very specialized to infect certain types of organisms, say mammals or birds. Sure, this can spread from species to species, as is in the case of zoonosis, but this only happens with different animals that are fairly closely related, such as humans getting a virus from other mammals or birds. During the early phase of the great 2020 coof, there were BS theories claiming the virus came from a snake. With the exception of Salmonella, pathogens coming from reptiles are very rare. The Panama fungus can ravage banana tree populations, but they can't cause a human pandemic because that fungus is specifically adapted to infect banana trees. A pandemic among banana trees would cause an economic recession for countries that export bananas as a large sum of their economy. It would also result in less bananas for us to eat, but it would not wipe out humanity despite the struggles it would cause to our food supply. Granted, if it happens for staple crops such as the Irish potato famine, this could have dire economic, political, and social consequences. Because diseases tend to be fine-tuned to their targets, this makes non-terrestrial diseases very unlikely to ever pose any serious threat without some incredible mutation that we haven't seen before. Perhaps a pandemic which wipes out humanity could be artificial though. During the past pandemic, there were theories related to gain-of-function research. This is research in which scientists alter an organism to enhance certain biological properties. This theory was widely dismissed at the beginning of the pandemic by mainstream media, but it did gain traction later on. Now, to be clear, I don't have a definitive answer, and while I lean into the zoonosis direction, I wouldn't be surprised if the lab leak theory turned out to be true. Could a super virus start a future pandemic? Maybe. In the science fiction movie The Planet of the Apes, a genetically engineered retrovirus wipes out most of the human population, while making other ape species more intelligent. Now, to be clear, I doubt the future is in the hand of a gibbon civilization, but the potential of a genetically modified disease is, well, rational. The lab leak theory did lead to the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity to establish tougher regulations on gain-of-function research. Another threat is that a supervirus or bacterium could be gene-edited in a government lab to use as a bioweapon. Some countries have tried to do this, but to be honest, it's just kind of a stupid weapon. Not because it's immoral, but because it's just ineffective. How do you stop the disease from spreading from your enemy back to you? It's not like the bacteria understand the concept of nationalism. For this reason, this scenario is rather unlikely. Most countries have banned the use of biological weapons, and the only cases of attempts to use biological weapons in recent memory were isolated regimes such as apartheid South Africa, as well as Saddam Hussein's Iraq. States usually act in a rational manner, and as a result, there's not much of an incentive to use biological warfare, as it easily hits your side just as bad as it does the opposite side. However, biological warfare could be used by terrorist groups if they ever manage to get their hands on dangerous microbes. Granted, this would still probably kill them in the process. The most notable example of this was in 1993, when a Japanese cult attempted a bio-terror attack by spraying liquid containing anthrax into a cooling tower of a Tokyo building. The cult believed that this would bring about a global pandemic, an apocalypse, in which only the cult members survived, and they would inherit the world. However, the Venn diagram between people who think they're going to inherit the world after the end times, and on the other hand, people who are intelligent and competent, are essentially two separate circles. The cult used veterinary vaccine strains of anthrax that was produced specifically to not transfer to humans through zoonosis. Thankfully, an epidemic, let alone pandemic, never occurred, and needless to say, the world did not end. The worst that happened was that people complained that it smelled like garbage and feces. I'm not fond of the smell of garbage and feces, but I think the scent of a Calcutta slum is far better than the destruction of civilization. This case study shows us that while most people, even sinister people, are still usually operating on a mostly rational basis, there are still irrational actors we have to worry about. Thankfully, irrational people are usually also incompetent. One serious threat that I predict that we are going to deal with is a superbug. Superbugs are potential pathogens which, through historical exposure to antibiotics and disinfectants, evolved to be extremely resilient through rapid mutations in which the weak individual pathogens die out while the survivors spread their genetics on to the next generation. These organisms can change rapidly as they replicate themselves at a fast pace. While these are usually clones, there are mutations that occur. Some of these mutations miserably fail, but others succeed, and the toughest, most resilient mutations succeed for a long time, even with our medical technology striving to destroy them. This puts us in a perpetual arms race against these microscopic organisms. Many pathogens are resistant to antibiotics, because we practically make animals overdose from antibiotics. I went to a hog farm and I saw hogs cramped up in tiny cages covered in bite marks, dirt, and piss. Maybe farmers wouldn't need so many antibiotics if pigs weren't in a box eating their own shit. After all, these farms combine the possibility of zoonotic diseases with antibiotic resistance. Viruses are already immune as they don't truly live, while bacteria, and to a lesser extent protozoa and fungi, are capable of causing ailments, and while the weak ones will die out, the stronger ones will survive and replicate. If there is some sort of superbug to emerge, I predict that it would probably come from animal agriculture. There will probably be some disease X that makes you spew high projectile pus from your. Granted, in the same way that it's almost impossible to eradicate pathogens, it is almost impossible for pathogens to eradicate us. While we humans can't clone ourselves, we have a different way of creating enough genetic diversity to survive. And it's through this amazing thing we call sex. The combination of genes from a mother and a father creates a unique person. And some of these new people, children, are more resistant to certain genetic ailments and certain pathogens than others. 10% of Europeans are immune from HIV due to a mutation called CCR5 delta 32, which blocks HIV's entry into the immune system cells. This was probably due to selective pressure in which Europeans who survived the smallpox and Black Death were able to spread this mutation on to further generations. Many Africans have a genetic predisposition to sickle cell disease, which, while debilitating in its own right, makes many people in Africa far more resilient to malaria infections, as their red blood cells, now turned into the shapes of sickles, no longer are able to allow the protozoa of the malaria pathogen to enter their system. Even if a pandemic did kill off a large swath of the population like smallpox and the Black Death did, it would almost certainly not kill all humans. The survivors, while traumatized by the event, would be able to pass on their genes onto later generations, descendants who will be more resilient and more resistant. Maybe humans will escape the biological arms race with killer microbes by transitioning into the digital world, merging with machines, or perhaps downloading their consciousness into cyberspace. But computers get viruses as well. The language we use for our digital devices is similar to the terms epidemiologists and doctors use. Computer virus and the phrase infected by malware are some examples. Contrary to popular belief, even Macs get viruses, albeit at a far lower rate. This is due to a smaller consumer base compared to PCs, similar to how large cities have the most rapid spread of pathogens while smaller cities don't. Plus, Macs have stronger inbuilt security, similar to having a tougher immune system, stronger white blood cells. Computer viruses, after all, are produced by hackers, similar to gain of function, albeit due to nefarious purposes rather than the scientific inquiry. Even video games can have pandemics. Just check out my video on how World of Warcraft changed the real world to learn about the corrupted blood incident. Now, the analogy between real diseases and computer viruses is not completely analogous, as analogies by their nature stop at a certain point. But it does show us that perhaps we are always in for some sort of arms race, no matter if we are made out of flesh or silicone. To be fair to these pathogens, part of the reason why we exist is because of them. For example, nearly all non-Australian mammals use placentas. It turns out that some of the proteins required for the evolution of placentas came from a virus. So without viruses, I wouldn't exist, you wouldn't exist, your dog, your cat, cows, pigs, bison, this weird fox thing, none of this would exist. The pangolins and bats wouldn't exist. So maybe they're not as bad as we once thought. Now, to be clear, I don't think a pandemic could wipe us out completely. Some people will be immune and pass on their genes. I still think the best thing at killing humans are humans. You don't get bacteria to do a human's job. And we'll get to that subject on a later chapter of the series when I cover nuclear weapons. Now, to be clear, there is a little bit of a skeptical optimist in me. I hope that one day these ailments will be in the position that smallpox is in now, an invisible killer, bringer of the apocalypse, now confined to a small bottle. We, in many ways, have humbled our hunters.